Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video, we're going to start using SQLite with our API, and we're going to sign users in. So we're going to be able to log in using SQLite. Now, what that's going to mean is that we are going to store users in SQLite, and when the user calls the auth endpoint, we are going to retrieve their username and password from the database. We're going to compare that username and password to the username and password they're sending in the request, and then we're going to see if they match, and if they do, we're going to send back a JWT token. Okay, so just to recap, what we've got right now is a class user that has an ID, a username, and a password. And then we have our security.py file, and there we have our in-memory database, which is none other than a Python list that has a single user, where the username is Bob and the password is ASDF. Then we have a couple of mappings, which allow us to retrieve users by username and to retrieve users by ID. When the user authenticates, i.e. sends in the auth endpoint with a username and password, what we do is we pass in the username and password here, we retrieve the user object using the mapping, and then we compare the user's password to the mapping's password. If they match, then we assume that everything is right, so we return the user, and that then gets used to generate the JWT token. Whenever they request an endpoint where they need to be authenticated, we use the identity method. So we get a payload coming from the request, and in that payload we get the identity, which is the user ID, and there we retrieve the user object using the ID mapping, and if that does match, then we assume that the JWT token was correct, and the user therefore knows that he is logged in. Okay, so that's what we've got right now. So what's clear is that we need a way to retrieve users by username, and we also need a way to retrieve users by ID. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up our database. In the test.py file that we ran earlier, we were creating the table here. And this table contained the user ID, username and password, and then we also inserted some sample data. This is a table that we're going to use for this video, and we're going to make a couple of changes in the coming videos. But for now, make sure to run test.py so your table gets created and some data goes in it, so that we can verify our API works. So we're going to just run this and make sure the data.db is created with some sample data. Okay. Once that's done, we should have data.db and some data in the database, but of course we have to change our methods to use the database instead of using this list. So let's do that first in the user.py file. The first thing we're going to do in this file is we're going to add the ability to retrieve user objects from the database. And we're going to start by importing SQLite 3, and apologies for that pop-up appearing there. So we're going to import SQLite 3 at the top, just so this class now is going to, well, and the entire file really, but we're going to write code in this class. This class is now going to have the ability to interact with SQLite. Okay, so we already know how to retrieve data from SQLite, so let's just go over it again. We've got an init method, which is going to take an ID, username, and password, so we're going to be using that throughout the video. The first thing I'm going to create is a new method, find by username. And this method is going to find a user in the database, searching by the user's username. Okay, and the thing it's going to take is self and username. Okay, so this username parameter is going to be the parameter that we are going to search by, and self is just what every method needs to interact with the object of type user. And then we're going to do the usual setup. First, set up a connection, which is done with SQLite3.connect, and then the database that we're connecting to, data.db. Then we're going to create a cursor, which is required to run the commands. Then we're going to create our query, which is going to be select star from our users table, where the username is a question mark. This where clause, all it's doing is it's filtering the results. So select star from users is going to select every row in the database, a row per user, and the where clause is going to limit the selection to be only those rows where the username matches a parameter. Okay? And then we're going to do that result is equal to cursor.execute, which is going to run the query, and we have to pass in a parameter so that the username gets a value, and that is going to be username, comma. Now remember, the parameters have to be, even though it's a single one, they always have to be in the form of a tuple. Apologies for that, that was an accidental deletion there. So always have to be in form of a tuple, and the only way to make a single value tuple is to use brackets, put the value, and then a comma, and then close brackets. So we've got here inside brackets the value and a comma. If we remove the comma, all that we are left with is the value inside brackets, which renders the brackets useless. That's usually used to do things like 5 plus 3 times 8, for example. The brackets here are used so that 5 plus 3 gets evaluated first and then multiplied by 8. If we omit the brackets, what runs is 3 times 8 first, and then 5 plus to it. So that's essentially what happens if we just have the brackets. We're running the username first, but there's really nothing to run there, so it's just kind of pointless to have them inside brackets. So we always need the comma at the end to tell Python that this is not a useless pair of brackets, this is a tuple that we're creating. Okay, so now the result has the cursor, which allows us to iterate over the rows, or to do row equals result.fetch1. That's going to just get the first row out of that result set. Okay. Now, if there are no rows, result.fetch1 is going to return none. Okay. So if the row is not none, and remember, if row is not none can just be simplified to if row, then we're going to create a variable user, which is going to be user row 0, row 1, row 2, and else user is none. And at the end, we're going to close the connection. Remember, we don't have to commit because we didn't add any data, and we're going to return the user. Okay, so what we've done here is initialize the connection, initialize the cursor, and then written a query which is going to search through the table for a given username, get the result set for that, get the first row, and then if there was a row, then we've created a user object with the data from that row. That is, row 0 is the first column, the ID, row 1 is the second column, the username, row 2 is the third column, the password. So each of these has to match the parameters in our init method. And if the row was none, then user is none. Finally, we close the connection and we return the user, which means we are either returning a user object or none. Now, notice that we're not using self anywhere in this method, but we are using the class name, user. So therefore, it is probably worthwhile making this a class method, changing the self for CLS, and then changing the user for CLS2. What that means is that now we are using the current class, which is user, as opposed to hard coding the class name there. This is just slightly nicer if we come to change this in the future. Also, notice how the row has 3 values. ID is ID 0, is index 0, username is index 1, and password is index 2. And this 0, 1, and 2 is in order, and they match the ID, username, and password. So instead of passing row 0, row 1, row 2, we can just do row, passing it as a set of arguments, of positional arguments, which just is going to expand to be the exact same thing. So what we've accomplished just is making things a bit nicer. Okay. Okay, so this is our find by username method. And now, believe it or not, we are going to do something you should really not do very often, which is copy and paste. So what we're going to do is copy and paste, make sure the indentation is correct so that these two new lines are indented the same as these. And we're going to rename find by username to find by ID. The username is going to be _ID. And really what we're going to do is change the where clause to be by ID. And then the parameter here is going to be _ID, which is the parameter name. And the same is going to apply for the rest. So what's going to happen now is we're going to do the exact same thing as above, but we're searching by user ID instead of by username. And now we have our two mappings. So what we've got now is the mapping on username and the mapping on user ID. Because what this username allowed us to do, this username mapping, apologies, was to retrieve a user by its username. And now we can do that with our find by username method. Okay. So the user is no longer going to be equal to username _ mapping.get. Now what it's going to be is user.find by username. The username is this parameter there. And all we're doing now is we're going to look in the database as opposed to in this mapping, which uses the list. So we can just delete all this really. And remember to also change the identity method to, instead of use the user ID mapping, it's going to use the user find by ID. Okay. So we've not changed the behavior of our app at all. All we have done is, instead of storing things in an in-memory database, now we're going to store them on a SQLite database. And we've allowed our program to retrieve users from that SQLite database. What I'm going to do is delete data.db just to make sure that there's nothing sort of old or wrong with it. Then I'm going to get the terminal. I'm going to clear this, spelling it correctly, and make sure you are in the right folder, which in my case is for section 5. Make sure you're in the right folder. And in this folder, I have the code folder, the VN folder, and test.py. Now, we have to do something very specific now. I'm going to run Python test.py, and this is going to create our data.db file. So if I do ls now, you'll see that data.db is here. When I run Python code app.py, it's going to know that I am running it from my current folder, section 5, and therefore all of the files that look for data.db are going to look in the section 5 folder. Okay? If I go into the code folder and then I do python app.py, we're going to have a problem because there is no data.db file inside the code folder. Okay? So the Python files are going to know that I'm running the code from within the code folder. It's going to look for data.db in there, and it's not going to find it. Okay, so make sure to be in the folder where you ran test.py. And then run app.py like that. Okay, so now we are running, and what we're going to do is go ahead and verify that everything works. So let's go on to Postman, and what I'm going to suggest you do is open up the section 4 collection that we've got here, and essentially duplicate it. So go ahead and press the 3 dots, press duplicate, and then you can rename this to section 5, and that's just because we're going to be making a few changes and a few improvements, so you don't want to be changing the previous version ones. Now we should be able to authenticate our users. We are not able to create new users yet, that's going to come in the next video, but we are able to authenticate. And you have to remember to use a user that does exist in the database. So let's go over back to Atom, open your test.py file, and make sure you're using a user that exists. In this file, we've inserted 3 users. Jose ASDF, Rolf ASDF, and Anne XYZ, so make sure to use one of those. Let's go back to Postman, and I've got Jose ASDF here. And indeed, when I press send, the expected comes out, which is an access token. Now, we can copy that and go over to post an item name. We're going to put in a chair, send that in. This method does not accept, it does not require a JWT token, but the get method does, so we're going to put that in. Press send. It tells us that the request does not contain an access token, so we're going to go into the headers, make sure to have authorization, JWT space, and then paste. And there we have the chair back. So we know that everything we've done does work. It's really important that after every video and after every piece of code you write, you test these things over and over again to make sure that you're not making any mistakes. If you went and wrote all of the code for this section, that is quite a lot, and then tested it, it would be really difficult to find where you've gone wrong. So it's a lot better to do this incrementally. Build things that work slowly and make sure that they work every time. Okay, so that's everything for this video. We are now able to log in using SQLite, but obviously there is static data in our SQLite database, so the next step has to be to write users to the database, allow them to sign up. So without further ado, let's go and do that in the next video.